I don't know when you knew, but I knew when Brand New Day actually connected with the audience because there was applause for the first time ever. I also genuinely loved the movie. I cannot remember the last time that I was in a room full of strangers and everyone had gathered to watch a story in isolation. And for just a little bit, those strangers acted like a community. And yes, some of that enthusiasm comes from the enduring popularity of Spider Man, and particularly Tom Holland's version of the character. The applause to me felt like a recognition of the fact that Spider Man Brand New Day is exactly the movie that we need right now. We are living in an increasingly isolationist world, and families have been divided by politics and more, and loneliness is becoming relatively ordinary. And we've become more emotionally aware while we are also experiencing an intense backlash against that awareness. We are learning to uncover our feelings that we were taught to suppress, and that process is messy. People can get hurt. We like to retreat and overwork and close ourselves off and divide our personalities into parts that we show to hide. And Brand New Day understands this in every way. It is a movie about people who create split selves in order to protect, and the chosen family that becomes possible when they allow themselves to be known beyond their usefulness. This distinction is really important because the movie is not simply about loneliness. It is about the isolation that is an act of self-division. Each of the characters in Spider-Man Brand New Day has constructed a boundary within themselves. Peter separates Spider-Man from Peter Parker as much as possible. Bruce Banner suppresses the original Hulk, as he's always done. Frank Castle refuses the part of himself that is capable of coming into another family. Ned has been separated from his magical identity that he discovered through Peter. And MJ has lost the history that allowed a more hopeful and emotionally open version of herself to emerge. Jean Grey searches for a sister while remaining divided to the frightening scale of her own power. And as a note, there are plenty of spoilers in this. Please don't watch it if you haven't seen it. In Brand New Day, these divisions do not all happen in the same way. Some are voluntary and some are imposed. Some protect the self while others supposedly protect the people around it. But they share the same underlying belief that if I cut off this part of myself, perhaps I can control the pain to myself and other people. The movie's answer is that suppression is not the same thing as safety, and a destroyed boundary is not the same thing as integration. Let's look first at the death of Peter Parker. At the end of No Way Home, Peter Parker undergoes something that no previous cinematic Spider-Man has experienced so completely: the total erasure of his human identity from the lives of everyone who loves him. Mysterio had already destroyed the boundary between Peter Parker and Spider-Man by revealing his identity to the world, but that was exposure and it was not integration. Peter did not freely reconcile the two halves of his life. One identity was violently forced into the other. The spell in No Way Home becomes Peter's attempt to solve that problem through a shortcut, the first spell. He wants everything he loves without accepting everything that love costs. And when he fails at that, he chooses the most extreme solution possible. Instead of rebuilding a healthy boundary between Peter Parker and Spider-Man, he erases Peter Parker from everyone else's life entirely, including his own. That choice is heroic, but it is also an act of radical self-division. Peter interprets isolation as responsibility, the only way he can express it, and he believes he can protect MJ and Ned by removing himself from their lives. By the beginning of Brand New Day, Spider-Man remains active while Peter Parker almost ceases to exist. And for the movie to work, we need to see this starting point, this bare minimum in Peter's life. And we need to understand that he is forcefully isolating himself from every form of meaningful connection. His relationship with the police detective initially appears to offer companionship. Oh, good job, Peter. The detective is almost Peter's Commissioner Gordon, but the relationship is highly conditional and it exists only while Spider-Man remains useful and walks the line perfectly. There is no tolerance for error because Spider-Man is not supposed to make errors. Peter Parker makes mistakes. Spider-Man performs a function. This is Peter's starting condition in Brand New Day. He is known entirely through his usefulness. And then Jean Grey, through the Scorpion, tests the new life that Peter has created. Peter has learned that revenge is not the answer. He learned this when Tobey Maguire's Peter 2, stopped him from killing the Green Goblin. And when Garfield's Peter, Peter 3, warns him about what happens when you no longer pull your punches. Peter, Holland's Peter, attempts to incorporate these lessons into his confrontation with Scorpion, but growth is rarely as clean as we actually would hope it would be. And when you are a superhuman, it is even less so. In this confrontation, we see the limitations of this strategy to kill Peter. Spider-Man becomes reckless and he almost kills a police officer. And the moment shows us how little room superheroes have to fail. And honestly, Marvel has increasingly depicted superhero escalation like mutually assured destruction. Every new power produces a new countermeasure, and every mistake becomes an argument for greater control. This is the world that Holland's Peter, Peter 1, lives in. But the scene also exposes the impossibility of Peter's new identity. Spider-Man cannot exist without Peter Parker's humanity. If Peter attempts to become nothing but a perfectly functioning superhero, every mistake becomes catastrophic because there is no human self left to acknowledge, learn from it, or ask for help. Let's get into the molting seasons of Spider-Man, which is explicitly pointed out in Brand New Day in the little YouTube video on the side. Brand New Day explicitly talks about molting as the ego death of Spider-Man. Spider-Man has always had a form of molting. For a snake, this is the growth that is happening when you shed your skin and you can grow. And for a human being, we call this an ego death. It is when an identity becomes too small to contain what we have experienced, so it has to surrender before another change can emerge or another person can emerge. There are multiple recurring molts that happen throughout the cinematic Spider-Man stories, and they do not happen identically in all three or in a perfectly fixed order, but each one changes the relationship between Peter Parker and Spider-Man. So the first molt is the death of inaction. In Raimi and Webb's films, which is The Amazing Spider-Man and the original Spider-Man that happened in the early noughts, Uncle Ben's death transforms Peter's refusal to act into a lesson that with great power comes great responsibility. Holland's version enters the Marvel Universe with that lesson largely ingrained. He expresses it to Tony Stark like this: when you can do the things that I can, but you don't, and then bad things happen, they happen because of you. That is a very oversimplified version of with great power comes great responsibility, but we can appreciate that. So the ordinary child who believes he can remain uninvolved is shed in this process, and Spider-Man, as we know it, is born. The second molt is exhaustion. Peter's attempt to reject Spider-Man. Maguire's Peter experiences through the psychosomatic loss of his powers. His body expresses a desire his conscious mind cannot admit, and he wants to stop being Spider-Man and recover the ordinary life that he sacrificed. Holland's version is different. When he loses Edith and Stark technology, it is not the loss of his actual powers, it is the loss of his inherited authority. Peter must discover what remains when he is no longer operating beneath Tony Stark's identity, resources, and expectations. We also recognize that he gave Mysterio Edith because he didn't want to be Spider-Man anymore. Garfield's story does not contain a precise equivalent, and it would be a mistake, honestly, to force every single Spider-Man into the exact same sequence. But if there is a very clear time in which Garfield's Spider-Man rejected his Spider-Man mantle, please let me know in the comments. The larger pattern is this: Spider-Man eventually becomes so costly that Peter wonders whether or not he can survive alongside him. Then we have the third molt. The third molt is the loss of Peter Parker's moral restraint. This is the moment when Spider-Man threatens to reject Peter entirely, or at least reject Peter's moral compass. Maguire's Peter is corrupted by the symbiote, which amplifies his resentment and cruelty, and he does not become Venom. Obviously, Eddie Brock does, but Peter temporarily becomes a version of Spider-Man that is detached from the compassion that gives his power meaning. Garfield experiences this molt off-screen. We hear him talk about it in No Way Home after Gwen Stacy's death. He explains in No Way Home that he became rageful and stopped pulling his punches. Holland's Peter approaches the same point after Aunt May's death, and he tries to kill Green Goblin in an effort to avenge her death. only to be stopped by Maguire's Peter. And the reality is that No Way Home, both Peters teach him two connected lessons. One is that revenge will not heal him, and the second is that Spider-Man must continue to pull his punches. Power without Peter Parker's humanity becomes vigilantism. So with these molts, we see that the first molt gives birth to Spider-Man. The second attempts to abandon Spider-Man. The third attempts to abandon Peter's morality and becomes Spider-Man only. But Holland's Peter experiences a fourth molt, or a deepening of the third one, which is the apparent death of Peter Parker himself. At the end of No Way Home, Peter does not merely place his personal life behind a mask. He removes himself from the memories of everyone who gave that life meaning. The world still has Spider-Man, but no one knows Peter Parker. That brings us 4 years later into Brand New Day. Peter's fourth molt is a total personality death. And this movie asks whether something new can emerge from the skin that he left behind. And can Peter Parker be resurrected? Ned is the first sign of this. It is fitting that Ned is the first person to begin resurrecting Peter Parker. Ned was the first friend to discover Peter's secret, so he becomes the first person that pulls Spider-Man back into Peter Parker.
Tony Stark made you that? Are you an Avenger? Yeah, basically.
See how they reverse it? But Ned also has become divided from parts of himself. His magical abilities emerged during his life with Peter, and that connection seems to have disappeared along with his memories of Peter Parker. What remains is what seems like a displaced energy that expresses itself through his addiction to trying to find Spider-Man and also to caffeinated drinks. The movie suggests that when a part of the self is suppressed, it does not vanish, it finds another outlet. Ned and Peter's connection is important because it is not based on Spider-Man's usefulness. We see that when they get to go back together again, they get to geek out together like they used to. Peter does not need to save Ned or recruit him or protect him. He is allowed to enjoy something with another person without having to be under the guise of Spider-Man. And this speaks to a theme of what it means to have chosen family. One of the definitions that I have for chosen family is that someone you are permitted to be unnecessary with. We can also see this amazing moment in Jacob Batalon's acting and that look that he gives him at the end after the handshake. I do genuinely believe that he is going to become the most conscious of what's going on because of his magical ability. He's not as susceptible to the spell, or it can be easily broken. By remembering Peter emotionally, Ned also begins recovering himself. Next, we have the next self-division, which is in Jean Grey. Jean Grey has always had a self-division, whether it was from Professor X or otherwise from the Phoenix. We do not see the Phoenix in this, but we do see that she is looking for another half. It happens to be in the form of her sister, who is not only her caretaker, but also a teacher. So finding her sister dead awakens Jean's higher powers, effectively the emergence of this version of the Phoenix. Who knows if we're actually going to see that in the MCU. But this awakening carries a terrible irony. Jean gains the power to resurrect someone only after arriving too late to save the person she wanted most to save, her sister. In Jean's constantly moving around to different people, you can see how she is the most obvious representation of what it means to have a split identity, because her identity is never seen until she chooses to reveal it at the end. It's only when she reveals her identity, you can see the parallels between her and Peter Parker, that she is able to come into her full manifestation of her powers. The reality is that she recognizes that she cannot change what happened to her family, but she can decide what the power born from this loss will become. Jean's relationship with Peter is also unusual because she does not primarily need Spider-Man's strength. It's just an anomaly that's unique to her. What she needs is Peter's relationship with Aunt May, because through him, accidentally, she gains access to an interior space that is shaped by love and grief and responsibility and memory that she needs to see in order to be able to heal herself. The scene in which Aunt May speaks to Jean inside Peter's consciousness is one of the movie's best moments, in my opinion. And honestly, I think it can only happen because Aunt May died, which is exactly what the Peters say in No Way Home. There's a reason that she died. Peter has built an internal space for her because she died. The loving voice that he carries within himself after the physical violence is gone. Well, also a call back to No Way Home when Peter 2 says to Peter 3, we really need to work on our interior voice. You are amazing, right? Peter 1 has created internal space that includes the most loving version of what he has, and he has carried that forward, and now he can gift it to Jean. And so I am very interested to see how everything will turn out with Jean. I love it that she's the first X-Men. I love the X-Men so much, so I'm so excited to see them in the MCU. All right, next we have is the Hulk or Bruce Banner, where the integration is not permanent. Banner has always embodied the split self more literally than any other Marvel character, and for years the MCU appeared to resolve that division through the smart Hulk. But Banner's intelligence and Hulk's body existed together. But Brand New Day brings us back to the original vicious Hulk and raises an important question. Why did that apparent integration fail? If anybody knows, you want to put in the comments. It may have been that I missed something as to why Smart Hulk isn't still around. Perhaps the point is that the integration is not a permanent achievement ever. We do not confront a hidden part of ourselves once and remain whole forever. Under pressure, old boundaries return and suppressed identities will have a tendency to reemerge. The work has to be repeated and repeated until it becomes ingrained. Even in the Hulk's most violent form, though, we see that Banner is still present. And in this movie, he ultimately chooses self-sacrifice. He chooses something the Hulk wouldn't do. He chooses to demonstrate the uncontrollable part is not necessarily the evil part. And we can see this, it wasn't really a self-sacrifice, but it was a moment in which Banner was able to come back into Hulk. Or it was Hulk himself. It's hard to say. I also love it how Hulk may become part of Peter's chosen family because they can have intellectual conversations outside of this. Their connection allows intelligence and curiosity and enthusiasm to return, the qualities that belong to Peter Parker rather than the public function of Spider-Man. Next, we have the Punisher. Frank Castle represents an inverse form of Peter's isolation. Peter erases his past to prevent his future pain, while Frank remains imprisoned in his past because moving forward would mean that he might risk another loss and perhaps have to admit that his life cannot contain something or anything beyond vengeance. He's obviously called the Punisher for a reason. Frank does not truly want to forget his family, and his endless war preserves his connection to them. If he stops punishing the world, he may have to confront who he is when there's just grief left. And that's really his only purpose, is to experience the grief. He represents the vigilante form of Peter and who Peter could have become after Aunt May's death. His desire for revenge has expanded into overkill, and Spider-Man must restrain him. But Frank's movement towards chosen family is not simply a lesson that force is wrong. It happens when he discovers that he can still provide something besides violence. Frank helps because he actually provides sanctuary. Ultimately, the sanctuary that Frank can produce was what he was not able to produce before, so it forms a sort of healing for him. It is the creation of a place in which other people do not have to justify their presence through what they can do. Frank, whose identity has been organized around destroying threats, discovers that he can also shelter people successfully. He is allowed to belong not because he is the Punisher, but because he can make room for others in his own space. So MJ and the morality of protection in Spider-Man Brand New Day. MJ's situation requires the most difficult moral examination. The spell did not merely remove Peter from her memory, it also separated her from the person she became while loving him. Early in No Way Home, MJ repeats her defensive philosophy: expect disappointment and you will never be disappointed. But when Peter later falls back on those words, she stops him and she says, no, we're going to kick some ass, or heal some ass. Loving Peter did not magically repair MJ or make her less pessimistic, but it allowed a more hopeful part of her to emerge. After the spell, that part has receded. Her emotional distance now affects her relationship with her boyfriend because the person she became alongside Peter has been divided from the person that she remembers being. But it's interesting because Peter's decision to withhold the truth cannot be treated as unquestionably correct. MJ asked him to find her and tell her what happened, and when Peter chose not to do so, he overrode her stated wishes because he believed that he knew what was safest. It was compassionate, but it was also controlling. Very morally ambiguous, honestly. It repeated Peter's central mistake, transforming love into unilateral protection. The question is not simply whether Peter should tell MJ, it is whether he can restore her agency without forcing an identity upon her. And you can see the parallels between Mysterio and Peter and MJ and Peter. Mysterio publicly exposed Peter and destroyed the boundary between Peter Parker and Spider-Man without his consent. And Peter cannot repeat the same violation by forcing MJ into an identity that she does not remember. Peter's letter to MJ is a symbolic doppelganger to Mysterio forcefully revealing Peter's identity as Spider-Man. It offers knowledge that forces a premature integration. The love that MJ has in this philosophical world is lost with the memory. And you cannot bring back the information without also bringing back the memory. Honestly, I secretly hoped that Jean Grey would replant those memories in MJ's mind at her behest, but not yet, or maybe not at all. So the letter brings down the barrier, and his original silent remains morally complicated. He may have acted from protection, but he still made her choice for her. The film understands that respecting another person does not mean hiding every dangerous truth from them. It means giving them the freedom to decide what will that mean. And when Jean takes control of MJ, the chain of events brings her back to Spider-Man's life. MJ falls and Peter saves her as a direct visual echo of Gwen Stacy and of Andrew Garfield's rescue of MJ in No Way Home. But Peter does not interpret that rescue as ownership. Saving MJ does not give him the right to determine her future. MJ is not yet a part of Peter's chosen family by the end of Brand New Day. That incompleteness is actually essential because Ned's bond with Peter begins returning instinctively, but MJ's return requires a conscious decision because she is aware of what was. Her arc is not about being restored to Peter as a reward, it is about recovering enough of her missing history to choose for herself. So what does chosen family actually mean? I mentioned how Brand New Day is exactly what we need because it outlines chosen family in an amazing way. The characters do not become family simply because they fight beside one another. Chosen family begins when they are known for more than their useful roles. Frank Castle is not only a weapon, he creates a sanctuary. Ned is not only the guy in the chair, he and Peter get to connect like they used to. Hulk is not only muscle, and Peter is not only Spider-Man. And Jean Grey is not only a weapon to be experimented on. They connect through curiosity and intelligence. Jean does not seek Peter for his physical power. She's only initially interested because he is an anomaly to her power. What she gets without intending is access to his relationship with May and the loving interior world that relationship created. MJ has not yet joined this family because her choice is still unfolding. Peter begins the movie with a conditional relationship based entirely on flawless performance. He ends up surrounded by people who can see him fail and remain present. That is the difference between a team and a family. A team values what you contribute. A family can know, especially a chosen family, can know who you are when you are nothing, when you don't have anything useful to give. Peter has spent years believing that responsibility means protecting himself from others. His resurrection teaches him that responsibility can also mean allowing other people to protect him. He cannot exist only as Spider-Man because Spider-Man is a role and no human being can survive as nothing but a role for very long. We have complexity and we have to acknowledge that complexity. Peter Parker's death and resurrection makes this internal transformation actually literal. His old identity has already died, but he has not yet allowed the new one to emerge. Jean's power gives him that opportunity. He molts, in this case, an actual death from the skin that was created at the end of No Way Home, and he emerges from the hospital as someone capable of being both Peter Parker and Spider-Man. The crucial difference is his consent. He's the one that reintegrates. Mysterio forced Peter's identity together by exposing him. Strange's spell allowed Peter to tear them violently apart. Jean does neither. Jean, whether she means to or not, she gives Peter the space to choose his way back into himself. In that amazing scene, I love that scene, with the ninjas. It's fantastic. I know they're not called the ninjas, but I can't remember the name right now. The same principle also applies to MJ. Peter cannot force her forgotten identity back upon her. The letter is the force. It is not voluntary. We will see where it goes from here. Wholeness is ultimately not created through involuntary exposure. That's the lesson. It cannot be produced through suppression either. It requires boundaries that can be opened by choice. And Peter's final transformation does not teach him how to prevent loss. It teaches him to relinquish the fantasy that isolation can prevent it. He cannot make Spider-Man and knowing Spider-Man completely safe. He cannot make Peter Parker invulnerable. He cannot love MJ, Ned, Jean, Frank, or anyone else without risking grief. Integration does not promise permanent peace. It gives him the ability to live honestly with powerful contradiction. Powerful and fallible, protective and in need of protection, Spider-Man and Peter Parker. Here are some Easter eggs and smaller details that I loved in Brand New Day. There's something honestly horrifying about the fact that they made Peter Parker create the universal mutation inhibitor that will likely be used against the mutants later. It is a very dark extension of what with great power comes great responsibility means. Peter develops a method for suppressing extraordinary nature, which is literally something that Stryker does in X-Men. So why give it to Peter Parker? Like, of all people, why Peter? Because what we know is that a unique solution like this can always be exploited by someone else. And the warning is pretty clear that you need to be careful what you create in an effort to suppress your own nature. And it may eventually be used to suppress everyone like you. The other Easter egg is VMAX. It honestly is amazing that they put a Hodor moment in here. And if you've watched Game of Thrones, you know what I mean by a Hodor moment. Using Max as Sadie Sink's reference word that she's trying to find is even more playful. Honestly, the entire testing sequence carries a lot of unmistakable Stranger Things energy. Like, you're going to be a human test subject. Like, isn't that weird that they chose that? I know she was filming Stranger Things at the time, but it just seems like really close Easter egg. Another Easter egg-ish is the visual language from Spider-Man 2 and 3, particularly when MJ is rescued and when the web-slinging sequences that look back to Raimi and Webb's Spider-Mans. I love that. And also, the Spider-Man mold always produces a new costume. The suit is not nearly a merchandise or decoration, though it does tend to end up that way. It is the external skin of Peter Parker's latest identity and a return to basic principles, which I love about this movie. Speaking of things that I love about this movie, here are the top things that I loved about Spider-Man Brand New Day, because I really did love it. I left the movie just feeling very warm and fuzzy. These are my top 5 moments. Spoilers ahead. The first is when Aunt May talks to Jean Grey inside of Peter's consciousness. And Peter actually comes into the room as well. I think that's such an amazing scene. Something that could only have happened if Aunt May had died, or else that space would have not been as easily accessible to Peter, probably. The thing is that we build the spaces inside of us that hold our inner self-talk, just like Peter 2 says in No Way Home to Peter 3.
But it's just the self-talk. Maybe we should, you know,
listen,
because you're amazing. Just to take it in for a minute.
Yeah. I can take it in. No, I can take it in.
You are amazing.
I can take it in.
You are amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Will you say it?
No, I kind of needed to hear that. Thank you.
Peter 1 learned from Peter 2 and 3 and created the most inner loving space that he could, which is just, it's brilliant. The second is, I love the moment that Peter reintegrates when he is fighting. It is brilliant because it is now entirely voluntary, because with Mysterio, he was forced into integrating. With Jean and the Red Ninjas, he chooses to come into the integration himself. He chooses to be Peter Parker and Spider-Man again. This mirrors exactly what he does with MJ earlier in the movie. The letter is the same device for MJ as Mysterio announcing Spider-Man's identity in Far From Home. MJ needs to come to the conclusion herself and not be forced into reintegration with her forgotten other half. So honestly, I think Peter was ultimately right in withholding the information with her. That doesn't make it any less sweet to see him integrate. I love it. The third is Jacob Batalon's acting in the muscle memory when he looks up at Peter Parker and you know that he remembers everything. I suspect this is because his magical ability is coming to the forefront and he was able to break the spell. The fourth is that I love that they went back to basic principles with Spider-Man Brand New Day. There's no Stark tech and there's no gadgets other than what he creates himself. Even if he creates a highly problematic piece of tech, but that's okay. The fifth is that I think this is honestly the movie that we all needed right now because we live in an increasingly isolationist world, which is exactly what this movie is about. It's about don't go isolationist. And if you go back to the main theme of the essay, you can see how I say that. You know that this movie is all about what it means to attempt to disconnect from parts of yourself and the world around you in an effort to cope, or to overwork, or to feel safe emotionally, or to feel that you can't hurt anyone with your emotions. And isn't that a common feeling that we all have now? The emotional awareness of our culture has increased exponentially, and so has the backlash against it. When you have feelings that you have been taught to suppress, and suddenly you're bringing them out to the forefront, it looks exactly like what Peter does when he is trying to cope with all of these new abilities. That's exactly how we all feel. Well, some of us. It's going to get messy and people get hurt, but as soon as we find a place and integration with all the parts that we have hidden, we can find a level of peace and stability again. Because the movie is ultimately about chosen family. Peter has no family anymore, no blood family, and we have all seen families broken apart from politics and policies. And this emotional awareness, people are going increasingly no contact. And in this movie, Peter refines his chosen family, people who have chosen him, who will cover for him, who will be there when he needs help, both physically and emotionally. We all need chosen family right now, and Spider-Man Brand New Day allows us to experience this firsthand. So I genuinely think that our culture is living through a crisis of its own self-division. We suppress our emotions because we're afraid they will hurt other people, or we overexpress them because we think that they are the most important thing. We overwork because usefulness is a better transactional currency than intimacy. We disconnect from family members who no longer understand us. We create public selves that can function while our private selves quietly disappear into bed rot and distraction, or have to hide for its own safety. And when those hidden parts finally emerge, they rarely do so gracefully. They look like Peter attempting to recover everything that he has suppressed. The process is confused and painful. People make mistakes, old anger surfaces, and carefully constructed identities can begin to crack. But the alternative is not peace, it is fragmentation, like we see in Brand New Day. The movie argues that we cannot protect ourselves forever by becoming smaller, we cannot avoid grief by making ourselves unknowable, and we cannot form a family while allowing other people to see only the parts of us that are powerful, productive, or useful. Peter Parker does not need to defeat Spider-Man, and Spider-Man does not need to eliminate Peter Parker. They need a boundary that allows both of them to exist, a boundary that can protect intimacy without destroying it. Honestly, that is why the applause in my theater felt so appropriate. A room full of strangers watched Peter emerge from isolation and create a new family. Then, for one brief moment, we stopped behaving like isolated strangers ourselves, and we became an audience enjoying a movie together. I'm Christina Wiltsey. This is Movies from Beyond, Spider-Man Brand New Day. Thanks so much for watching. If you made it all the way to the end, please subscribe and consider subscribing to my Substack.